the first thing. A second area where I think it might be interesting to do some more work is to think, again, less about intellectuals or necessarily even national politicians, and look at sort of the middle strata of figures who were popularizers of ideas that were developed by, for instance, the Mont Pelerin Society, other people who would identify as high intellectuals, but who were the people who translated between these very, very elite groups that we have a lot of work about, elite groups and individuals, and this grassroots contingent that we also have a lot of work about. How do we get actually from one to the other? Because very often they weren't talking to each other directly, and they weren't really even interested in talking to each other directly. The grassroots, as much as they may be reflecting the ideas of, again, Ayn Rand, Mont Pelerin Society, they are not necessarily embracing that, and in fact may have an anti-intellectual tradition. So who is it that makes these ideas popular? How does that happen? What are the points of dissemination? And there's some interesting work going on right now around figures like Clarence Mannion, kind of radio and media pioneer, other figures as well. But I think it would be interesting to look more seriously at that sort of middle stratum. Donald Critchlow's book on Phyllis Schlafly is another interesting example. And in fact, one of the kind of uneasy aspects of that book is that it's called Phyllis Schlafly and the Grassroots Right, and it's not quite clear. So is Phyllis Schlafly part of the grassroots? Is she not? Is she part of the elite? Exactly, I think she's another figure that fits in that sort of middle stratum. And I would argue that J. Edgar Hoover is actually a figure that fits in that middle spot. As I said, Hoover is not an intellectual, but he is someone with a very powerful worldview, a very powerful, I would argue, conservative worldview, and he is a great propagandist. One of the things that he sets the FBI to doing, particularly around the issue of anti-communism, but around religious conservatism, around ideas about the state and its development, he sets the FBI to working on publishing magazine articles, dispersing television shows, radio shows, etc. The FBI was a kind of amazing media production agency in addition to being a law enforcement agency. So the figures who form those points of transition between the elite and the grassroots, I think, are another area of interest. And the last one that I would throw out is the question of ideas in action. And this, for those of you who were at the very similar panel yesterday, I sort of mentioned this at the very end in a comment from the audience, but thinking about how it is that conservative ideas have actually influenced policy. Because very often, I think, both in terms of intellectuals, where we end up writing about their ideas and say that those ideas have consequences, and look, people are still talking about those ideas, but it's very hard to trace those consequences. But particularly in terms of politics and policy, I think very often we have a story that's about elections, it's about movements, and it's about getting people into power, and we pay a lot less attention to how those people who profess to be conservatives actually act when they are in power. This is partly because we're just developing a story of a figure like Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, this sort of this burgeoning Reagan historiography. But there are any number of other figures where we might really think out this conversation as well. How is it that conservative ideas are put into policy? How much do they last? What are the constraints on these ideas? How successful have conservatives actually been at putting their ideas into legislation, into policy, and into action? So those are three areas that I think, in addition to all of these other areas we've discussed, we might think about doing more work. And I wanted to also just throw out two fairly tangential comments. One is that for both of you, but for Jennifer as well, I would be interested in sort of the tension of writing seriously about someone who sometimes has some really crazy ideas, right? This is something that's looming ahead for me as I begin to work on the Hoover Project, but someone whose ideas aren't necessarily very good, and the tension between when you argue that you're going to take someone seriously, there's a process of legitimation that goes on there. And I think in much of the literature on conservatism, and we can talk about particular cases if we want, but actually people have gone too far in taking these ideas seriously because some of them just aren't all that good. So that's one thing that I thought we might talk about. The second one is actually just to throw out what I noticed in the OAH program, for instance, is that Maybe what we should be having actually up here is not a panel on the new intellectual history of conservatism, which seems to be surging ahead and be very vibrant, but is what a new intellectual history of liberalism would actually look like. Because I think for graduate students in the audience, the study of liberalism may be on its way back, trying to understand liberalism at this point. Now, maybe there are fewer panels that use the word liberal and liberalism simply because the entire conference is premised on a set of liberal presumptions, and that therefore we don't have to use the word. But I think that that word has gotten lost, actually, in the historiography and in the way that we talk about the development of the United States in the 20th century. So maybe liberalism is on its way back as a subject of study.
To our panelists, just a few stray ideas here, and then, as I said, I'll open it up to have your contributions. I was hoping to get through this today without talking about Glenn Beck, but Jennifer ruined that for me. I'm not sure actually he is in that much trouble, sadly to say, because I think in some sense his comments about social justice really kind of tap into that come-outer separatist tradition within American evangelicalism. It's an extraordinary exercise of chutzpah for a Mormon to do that, but then we all knew that the man does have guts. Anyway. I would like to say a hearty amen also to Leo Rebuffal's comments yesterday, and something that Jennifer echoed today, about our need to explore conservatism in the pre-World War II era, and that almost any hermeneutic, any approach that we use that encourages folks to do that, I would support, and dare I say even the pre-World War I era, which is where my own work has been more recently. Also, as far as the terminology problem that Angus mentioned, it is a striking one, and of course it's raised by several of these immigrants, immigrant intellectuals. Is it not perhaps rooted more in the European political terminology, and they confront the problem of what do they call themselves in their new American environment? Certainly a transnational approach here really is crying out. I think my own work has suffered from not being more transnational. And I think that brings us back to good old Louis Hartz, who was invoked yesterday. Despite the limits of his book and his work, nonetheless, Hartz was able to do that, I think, really brilliantly in a way that many have not been able to do since then, or have chosen not to do. And anything, as I said, that promotes that transnational approach, I think, would be a good thing. But I do want to open it to the floor to questions and comments here.